Hi everyone. Who of you is a young parent with young children? Or maybe an old parent with young children, like me, 1 year old to 3 years old. You put your kid to bed in the evening and the kid goes to sleep. Was a bit uneasy, but that's not very unusual. 1, 2 hours after putting this kid to sleep, it wakes up and starts crying. You think, okay, usual stuff. You go to the bed, pick it up. Unusually now, this time, it doesn't stop crying. It cries harder. It cries out of pain. As parents, we have all witnessed this. We have all experienced this. In some cases, parents decide to go to the emergency room. And at the emergency room, usually it's happening during the night. So at the emergency room, clinical diagnosis investigation is performed and the baby is still uneasy. The physician comes back with an antibiotic and explains that is most likely an acute otitis media by the clinical picture. Give this antibiotic for 3 days or for 7 days and you move on. On the next day, this baby is fine if the antibiotic works. Did you know that 50%, depending on the region, can be 40 to 60% of acute otitis media cases can be driven by viral infections, be it influenza, rhinovirus, RSV, and others. For these, antibiotics would not be useful. We will talk about this more in detail in the coming 20 minutes. Stay tuned. Enjoy the talk. Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to highlight the impact of vaccines on antimicrobial resistance, also in short AMR, as it is a quite important topic. Most of the time when I speak with people about this specific topic, antimicrobial resistance, what do I hear? The answer is, let's make new antibiotics. Have you seen the landscape about antibiotics and formation with multiple companies having shut down their own research area for antibiotic research, still moving forward, but the big companies are most frequently buying smaller biotech companies that are currently producing or researching on new type of antibiotics. But the return on investment is relatively low for these new antimicrobials, and therefore the incentive is relatively low. It is problematic, and let's try to work against it and in favor of something else, because I deeply believe, having worked in vaccines and in antimicrobial drugs development on both sides, I have seen that vaccines can actually play a major role in reducing antimicrobial resistance. AMR is something that is a resistance that is forming under the pressure of a toxic agent, being the antimicrobial drug, antibiotic, that is about to kill the bacteria or to reduce their growth patterns. And over time, these antimicrobial resistance features are not only acquired by this bacterial population, but they need to be transmitted to other hosts, so other humans in this specific case. Let's have a look at this graph. You see this illustrated very nicely. On the left side, you see the population, pathogen population side. On the time post-exposure, and you see the dotted bar being the transmission threshold. And when you look at the dotted line here, the normal course of infection in most cases goes up, goes over the transmission threshold. So this is when a human being is infectious and infects other people, and then peaks to some point. Now there are very different scenarios that can be imagined. Here we want to focus on two things. First, the blue lines depict the action of antibiotics. They're given at a time point when the transmission rate is very high, the transmission threshold is already very far below the dotted line of bacteria, and the blue window here is actually the window of formation of antibiotic resistance, because the toxic agent, the antibiotic, is acting on the bacteria and killing 99% to more of the bacteria. Meanwhile, some bacteria acquire some resistance if the antibiotics are not given at a relevant dose or during a relevant time. So there are many reasons that could then provide an underdosing and allow the bacteria to breathe a bit and mutate and be selected for resistance to which they were formerly susceptible. Now, let's have a look at the red curve. The red curve is showing what happens to the pathogen population when a vaccine is given at an earlier time point. The people are protected and the population may grow a bit and is then shut down, but it never reaches the transmission threshold. And this is actually the main difference between antibiotic use and vaccine use. Now, if we go to real life examples over decades, actually, we have centuries of experience, but with antibiotics, which were invented in the 1920s, we have mainly decades. We see that whenever an antibiotic was invented and put to broader use, resistance formation was identified very early. And nowadays we can even say that as soon as we work on an antimicrobial, be it linezolid or any other, that is already 20 years old, but still it is one of the more recent ones, or be it daptomycin and others. These drugs have found resistance already in nature in bacteria before this drug was approved. So for vaccines, you very rarely see resistant formations, and this is a topic for a different post, but we can talk about this as well. How can resistance occur and develop under the pressure of a vaccine? That should not happen theoretically, but nature is not black or white, so this is also a very important topic. So when you look at these three groups, antimalarials, antibiotics, and vaccines, vaccines is clearly the winner. And then later, when we look at acute otitis media specifically, and there are data from Turkey where a 51% reduction in the incidence of otitis media, acute or chronic, in children who have been vaccinated against influenza compared to unvaccinated controls. So here, the antibiotic use was similarly reduced in vaccinated children as a consequence. So both effects, you have less disease and therefore you have less impact because you have less use of antibiotics, which are actually the reason of formation of antimicrobial resistance. When we look into antimicrobial resistance in acute otitis media, we need to understand that around 50% of AOM cases, acute otitis media cases, are driven by viruses, for which you don't need antimicrobials because they work only on bacteria, roughly speaking. So if you have a vaccine against a virus like influenza and you severely reduce the number of cases, of clinical cases, be it in children, be it in adults, you have a very strong setting saying here that a vaccine can reduce the use of unnecessary application of antimicrobials, because the acute otitis media that is happening due to an influenza virus usually would not be overcome and cured by antibiotic use. That is actually putting a pressure on all the microbiota in the human being without a benefit to the human that receives this antibiotic. And yet it takes the natural course, and everyone who is a parent knows very well, I remember this from my kids, very much, it is something you don't want to live through the first time. I remember when my firstborn son was 1 year old, he had a strong acute otitis media, and that he is not sleeping. He has pain in the ear. This pain is triggering a lot of unrest, a lot of crying throughout the night. So the kids don't sleep and are exhausted in the morning. The parents don't sleep and are exhausted in the morning. I don't want to think back about this. However, it is something, if it can be avoided, you better wish to avoid it. And I would today clearly opt for influenza vaccination during the season, even for the kids, where it is recommended, or if you have the possibility to do so. That is what I have done with my latest children, at least protecting myself and my wife so that we don't bring it home. However, you still have the daycares, facilities where our son can still get this infection. And I think this is valid for every parent who has these decisions to make. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit more about acute otitis media, also abbreviated as AOM. And what do vaccines and AMR have to do with everyday medicine? At Artema Academy, we believe that prevention is the most effective form of antimicrobial stewardship. Acute otitis media is one of the most frequent infectious diseases in pediatrics, and one of the clearest examples of how vaccination directly reduces antimicrobial resistance, AMR. Let's go into details. Now, I've listed before in the very beginning of this lecture some details about epidemiology. To recap, across Europe and the United States, AOM affects up to 60 to 70% of children under 5 at least once in this 5-year period. And studies show that around 50% of AOM cases are of viral origin, caused by RSV, rhinovirus, influenza, or adenovirus, and others. And they do not benefit from antibiotic treatment. You can find this in the publications where it's nicely summarized by Heikkinen and Conmai and New England Journal of Medicine in 2021, Kempf in CMI 2015, but also Fuji in Journal of Infectious Diseases in 2025. More recent data, Kim et al., MDPI, Antibiotics, published in 2026, so this year actually. Yet, in clinical practice, antibiotics are prescribed in most AOM encounters, creating substantial and unnecessary selection pressure on bacterial pathogens, such as Streptococcus pneumonia, Haemophilus influenza. Vaccines. Let me give you two examples. Pneumococcal conjugate vaccines, PCV, and influenza vaccines both reduce AOM incidence overall, and thereby antibiotic use. PCV introduction led to a 64% reduction in antibiotic-resistant pneumococcal infection in children and a 45% decrease in adults over 65 years. You can find this in Hampton and JID 2012 or Tomczyk CID in 2016. Nice, well done publications. When it comes to influenza vaccination, it reduced actually the inappropriate antibiotic prescriptions for respiratory infections by 43 to 47% and lowered AOM incidence by 50% approximately in children. These are data from Turkey back in 2006. They were published, and from Jeffrey Kwong, published in CID in 2009. Yeah, I was wondering what was the loop actually that is currently closing in on here. When we have more infections, this leads to more antibiotic use. In this specific example, to more selection pressure onto the bacterial pathogens, but also on other, not only pathogens, but commensals, for example, that we have in the body because the antibiotics are a systemic treatment. This leads to more AMR and therefore in the future to a less effective pool of antibiotics. AOM makes this feedback loop very visible in everyday medicine. When vaccine coverage declines, bacterial AOM rises, antibiotic use increases, and resistance accelerates. Our perspective at Atama Academy is that vaccines do protect children, vaccines do protect antibiotics, and vaccines protect the future of infectious disease medicine as we know it. AOM demonstrates this principle with exceptional clarity, showing how routine immunization can transform AMR prevention from theory to measurable public health impact. My name is Frederick Wittke. I'm physician and co-founder of Atama Academy. Have a wonderful day.